Hey, everybody. Welcome again to another episode of the ShopNotes podcast. I'm your host, Phil Huber, joined today by Logan and some very special guests. We're going to be talking with Vic and Hague about Melbourne Tool Company and a new line of hand tools. So thanks for joining us and hope you enjoy today's show. Well, Vic, you've been on the show before, although you've probably blocked it out. Therapy does that.
Glutton for punishment.
Yeah, yes, I came back. Yeah. I did it again.
Logan and I, on the other hand, are addicts. So, but you're sharing your desk with somebody else today. Would you like to introduce?
Yeah, this is Hague Haswell, and he's the owner of Melbourne Tool Company. Come from all the way from the southern hemisphere.
G'day, how's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
Pretty good.
I hear you're in town for the IWF show coming up next week.
Yes, Tuesday next week. Looking forward to it.
So, did you guys have a booth there?
We do. Yeah.
Ooh, hey, I'll swing by. Yeah. I'll be there.
Oh, good. Awesome. Yeah. We have a booth there, and I'll be making a mess of the place and having fun.
Cool.
I'll be roving the halls. So, wearing two hats next week.
Logan's super excited about it because he was like, I just have not sweated enough this summer.
100%.
I need to go to Atlanta and do it even more.
In August.
Actually, I've done
so humid.
I've done some training. I actually just came back from Vietnam on a family holiday. So.
Oh, there you go. Yep. So you got it.
Yeah.
I'm ready to go.
Pre-sweating, opening up the pores.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Pre-sweating. I like that.
Got all the tricks down pat to be able to make it through the day.
All right. Well, here we're talking about Melbourne Tool Company, and this may seem like a stretch for you, Hague, but I have one of my favorite hand planes is like 100-year-old plane made by an American department store called Montgomery Ward's. They had a line of planes called Ward's Master, and it's a fantastic tool. And part of what makes it fantastic is that it was just a middle of the road department store hand plane. It wasn't trying to be at the top. It wasn't trying to be a super discount tool, but for the most part, those tools don't exist anymore in the hand tool world. I don't think.
That's right. Yeah. Well,
and that's where I feel like you're trying to make that connection.
Yeah, that's definitely right. I mean, so I've got a retail business over in Australia called TimberCon, and we're very much about that middle of the road. The majority of woodworkers or furniture makers, in terms of machinery, tools, things like that, and that's really where Melbourne Tool came from. I mean, there's nothing between the bargain basement, the home improvement store, hardware store offerings that are around these days versus, the tool makers that I think brought back some of the tradition, like the North American plane makers. But there's nothing really left in that middle of the road space. Nothing that you kind of just take out of the box and start using and rely on. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess that was, because Logan, he showed off a couple of your tools there that I got to play with at his shop. And that's exactly the thing, is that they're well-made tools, accessible, and you know exactly what to expect from them when you open up the box.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we spent a huge amount of time on development. I think partly around ergonomics, because really at the end of the day, when you start looking at a plane, I mean, there are, fairly basic, design principles of a plane that you can't really change all that much. And so what is it that you really have to look at that people are looking for in a tool? And it comes down to performance and something around performance is, how comfortable it is to use as a tool. And so we spent a huge amount of time on that.
So how did you end up finding, or maybe describe a little bit what it took to be able to find that sweet spot? Because I'm sure that the temptation is there to just take it one more level and then one more level, and then one more level, and then all of a sudden you're a boutique tool maker?
So the way that we got started was we started looking at just manufacturing, I guess, a fairly generic plane. And we found that we were having a lot of issues to do around getting that done to the quality level that we needed to. And so we took a step back and we said, well, we really have to understand how the tool is made to be able to get it made well. And so we brought on an industrial designer called Alexandra Pontonio. And she's a industrial designer, furniture maker, based in Melbourne. And we basically just started the design process from concept, how does it look, how does it function, and as we were going through that process, we very quickly realised that there were two people at opposite ends of the spectrum. One was Alex. I think she's about 5'2". I'm around 6'4". I don't have overly large hands, but I guess relatively in proportion, and Alex was as well. And so a lot of the arguments came about over comfort of the tool in the hand, because that's the whole thing about planes. Being a hand tool, it's very, very tactile. Right. And so we spent a lot of time, not just on things like the handles, but the overall form of the tool. The ease of adjustment. Getting your hands into certain places. Like the Norris adjuster, things like that. We spent a huge amount of time around that, and it was a lot of arguments back and forth between her and I initially that really drove the development of the tools as you see them now.
So right now, the Melbourne line is a set of planes, a router plane, a couple of router planes, I think.
Two router planes, yeah.
Yep, and then a couple spoke shaves.
Yeah, and a camera scope.
Right. Where have you guys seen the most success with those? As far as, I'm guessing the main three planes are the big ones, right?
The block plane definitely was, I would say, would be number one globally. It's interesting though, because we were just looking at how things are going here in North America, and the pattern of sales here so far hasn't necessarily matched what we've seen in Australia. Like in Australia, I would say that the pattern of sales would be what we would normally see in a plane range, but I think the days of the number 4 and the number 5 and the block plane probably being those core tools, I think while they're still there, people are using hand tools in a very different way to how they used to, say, going back 50 years ago. There's a lot more use of machinery or stationary power tools, also handheld power tools, and so generally speaking, people are kind of reaching for a hand plane now for finishing work. And so we find really good success actually with the router planes. They've been very, very popular. Yeah. Yes, obviously the block, the low angle jack, and then the two router planes, but then also the spoke shaves have been incredibly successful. Mm-hmm. And spoke shaves, they're kind of out, I guess to a certain extent, out of that traditional furniture making space. You tend to be going more into either carving or I guess more artistic woodworking. But we found really good success with those. Yeah.
Well, and I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that because the line is fairly small, it's really the core tools. And it's like, especially in today's day and age where, most people identify as a hybrid woodworker, where they're doing, 60, 70, 80% of their work with some sort of power tool or machine. And then they're doing that final, surface preparation or, adjusting the depth of a dado or adjusting the thickness of a tenon, and they're able to do that with like a router plane and all that other stuff. There's a lot more. We all know that there's a lot more esoteric tools out there, but you really don't get into needing those unless you've sort of resolved to be a quote unquote hand tool woodworker. Yeah. So it's I think like all the planes and spoke shaves and scraper are performing well because they're this sort of they're the core things that any woodworker in this century would use to augment what they've already got in their shop.
Yeah, and we started off, I think, with originally an idea of doing like around about 12 or 15 tools, and as we went through the process, we started off kind of looking at certain other tools and thinking, do we really need that? Well, you can kind of get away with, using something else that's, now in the range. You can kind of get away with something else that's in the range. So when you start looking at things like shoulder planes, for instance, a shoulder plane still has its place. You can sort of use a lot of the other tools in the range in the place of a shoulder plane in most instances. And so it's trying to keep it as simple as possible. And so we've ended up with the 9, and I'm not really entirely sure whether we're going to hit the double digits. I mean, unless we get, a huge amount of feedback from the market saying, you should really look at this one. I'm pretty sure we've hit the full range already.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that, like all of those specialty planes that you see in the other ranges aren't necessary, but I guess we're going with the 80-20 rule. 80% of the applications can get covered with 20% of the range of tools that are available. And I guess that's where we've ended up with the 9.
Yeah. Well, one thing I really like about your guys' router plane is that it's a straight blade, so it's super easy to sharpen. Right now, my digital editor up in Minneapolis has the planes and the router plane. I have the spoke shaves. And I said, look, here's what I really like about this router plane is it doesn't have that little hooked blade, that little 90-degree blade like a traditional router plane does, which those are a pain in the butt to sharpen. Throw this in your sharpening guide like you would a chisel and sharpen it.
But it's also got that massive support behind it as well. Like you've got the blade, you've got the bed that it's sitting in. You've kind of got a huge amount of mass that sits behind that cutting edge, and so as you're pushing it through, it really drives through, and you don't get that on some materials. You kind of get that chatter. And I don't think we actually were really thinking it through when we were doing the testing. I think we just had a piece of material lying around, and it happened to be like Vic Ash, which is an Australian timber. And it's a very fibrous timber that, has a tendency to kind of tear out. And going along the grain, it's perfectly fine for machining. But going across the grain, it's a nightmare. So cross grain, end grain cutting, it's pretty difficult. And that's what we were using to test on. And we just found that this design of router plane was working exceptionally well on that material. And so when we were testing on other materials, it's just going through it like butter.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that I really like about the router plane is that at first I was skeptical because it's bedded at 55 degrees, which is actually, it's pretty high.
Pretty steep, yeah.
And again, when you understand Australian timbers, you recognize that those are just rocks that grow from the ground. And then, you try to make furniture out of them. But the fact that it's at 55 degrees, I find when you're going across the grain, and if you guys had a chance to try them out, they actually cut cleaner because really wood fails fairly easily when you're cutting across the fibers. And so you still, you're not obviously getting like a mirror cut or anything like that, but I find that you get a cleaner result with the higher angle than what is generally a pretty low angle when you look at sort of the conventional L-shaped router blades. This just and it kind of harkens back to like if you're using if you're cutting a mortise by hand using a mortising chisel, and the mortising chisel has like a super steep 34 or 35 or 40 degree angle on it, and it just when it goes across the grain, it just shears really nicely. So that's another aspect of that I really like.
Yeah, we
well, that's what I was going to say is that high angle is much more of a scraping action.
Yeah.
So
we spent a bit
really
of time
well
on that.
Hard stuff.
Yeah, we were getting poor old Narix mortise chisels because, we're kind of like, where's the material that we can get to test this on? So we're like, so we sell Narix chisels and we get, cutting up mortise chisels and grinding them and Frankensteining them and like jamming them into these, into these tests.
That's what you do though when you're,
I got to apologize to Philip next week when I see him.
All of a sudden, there's a war brewing between the Czech Republic and Australia.
Yeah. What happened?
He's pretty crazy. I'm sure I'll buy him a beer and all will be forgotten. Yeah.
So Vic, now talk about your involvement with Melbourne Tool Company and how that got started.
Right. So I've known Hague for quite a few years because I had traveled a few times to go to teach in Australia, and whether his, like, the parent company that he owns, Timbicon, was a sponsor of events in different spaces and stuff. So just got to know him, and one of the times I was down there, he was talking about the struggle of getting a decent hand plane down there, because like we have the problem where we have like either a plane like object or like a super high end plane. That's our options in North America, or was our options in North America. And then it was even worse in Australia, because by the time you took those premium planes down into Australia, like the price in a lot of cases almost doubled. And so now, asking $600 for a hand plane like that, you know what I mean? Like even people with lots of money kind of balk at that a little bit. And so he had made this decision to, try to do his own thing. And he said, listen, I'm going to make these planes, and I'd really like to send you some of them to see what you think. And, draw on some of the R&D background that I have, and hand tool woodworking background. And so he sent the planes up, and like I was fully prepared to not like them, because they're made in China, and I thought, well, like I know what a Chinese plane is, right? I've used them, I've tried them. I'm pretty certain I know what's going on. And then I pulled them out of the box, and I sharpened them, and I started using them, and I was like, this is weird. This is actually pretty good. And we actually had a joke that we were going to come up with a t-shirt that said MTC, they're not shit. And because that was my reaction. I was like, wow, these are pretty good. And so then I come to find...
No. You actually use those terms. You're like, wow, they're not shit.
Yeah.
I'm like, thanks. Like that's a few years worth of work, and I'm kind of like sweating to kind of get the feedback and everything. It's like, they're not shit. Okay.
Yeah. Right. Thanks for that. I'm glad I sent them to you.
Yeah.
Is that a backhanded compliment?
It kind of is. Yeah. Everybody says Canadians are nice, but we do it with a smile.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then I sort of come to understand, like, MTC isn't made by a Chinese plane company. They're made by a company that focuses on tool and die, and they make scroll chucks for lathes. So I mean, they understand what flat is, they understand what square is, they understand tolerances, right? And so Hague presented these drawings to these guys and said, hey, can you make these? And they were like, I don't know, maybe. And so they did, and then what they had produced was like shockingly amazing.
But I think the other thing as well is that, when you talk about Chinese manufacturing, like the design process was done by woodworkers in Melbourne, and it's when you've got the people who are actually kind of using the tools, who are doing the design work, when you're going through and you're finding certain issues, and you're like, well, this works well and this doesn't work so well, or this needs to be tightened up, or this needs to be improved on. I mean, I guess we had an idea in mind of, hey, this is roughly, what we'd like to sell them for. But, a lot of the times, there were kind of decisions made about, well, we really need this change. And it's like, and the factory was like, well, we can make the change. It's just going to cost you more. And, at every point in that process, it's like, well, we want a tool that works properly, so we'll pay it. And that was the process. And I suppose, the other thing as well is, the factory that we chose, I think people kind of have this idea of like, oh, like China, like it's one big factory, it's like something out of like a futuristic sci-fi novel, where it's just, like rocks go in and then out the other side is like all of the products that you see on the shelves. Whereas the factory we work with, it's actually like a small family factory. And the main person, the main driver behind it is a lovely woman that actually had just had her first baby. Going back in, I think, late May. And she's kind of the driving force behind the quality of the planes. Like, she kind of gets it, She's not some, like, old dude that's just, trying to eke out a living. Like, she understands, I guess, what, modern consumers are looking for, because she is one herself, and you when you spend time with her and spend time at the factory, she's walking around the factory floor and she's looking at all the things, all the components of the planes and how they're being produced, and QC issues and picking up problems and getting them fixed and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's they are made in China. They're made with a lot of care though, and I suppose that's the important thing, And they're made
well, and that's something that I've said for a long time is, I work with a lot of tool companies, and China will produce stuff to whatever quality you want. You just have to be willing to do your due diligence on the front end, like you guys have, and you have to be willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
So
totally.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the thing, because we get a little bit of pushback. If it's made there, surely it should be cheaper. And it's like, well, sure, it could be. One of the things that it kind of it still hurts is like the pricing of the blades. But on the one hand, we could have dropped 10% out of the price of the range, just on changing the blade material, but we didn't. And the blades that are in them, they're probably not the absolute best plane blades that you can get in any plane around the world, but they're pretty damn good, and they stay sharp for so long.
Right.
And that's the thing, because, people, I guess, we didn't aim it at beginners, but we aimed it at people who probably have been woodworking for a while, and then they're probably getting into hand tools. And, we very much wanted the idea of, you can't spring for the big name brands. You can buy this, and you're probably not going to look at getting another one again. Buy once, buy right. And so one of the big things was the quality of the blade, but the fact that you can sharpen it and then you can use it for a long time. Because as opposed to spending all your time sharpening, you want to spend more time actually doing work. So so there's a lot of things that went into it like that.
Well, and it's at that point where I tell people, like, look, you're looking for a department store blade, like you're looking for a Lowe's big box store hand plane. That's not what this is. This is every issue that has been fixed.
Yes,
it's not a highly polished boutique maker.
Yeah,
it is a good user that you can just get out of the box, maybe strap the blade once or twice and put it to work.
Yeah.
Well, the way I compare it is I use a automobile analogy, and I say, like, I would love nothing more than to go collect my groceries in a Maserati. But the reality is that I can't afford a Maserati. And so, but my Nissan, it does a pretty good job, right? And it's dependable. It'll get me there. I don't have to worry about, like, it's not a Pinto. It's not like if I get rear-ended, it's going to explode. And so, I think there's more woodworkers in that space than in the sort of high-end, in the high-end market. And I also think that a lot more people in the sort of middle space are going to buy these planes and use them. Whereas I think a lot of sort of premium brands get purchased and put on a shelf and sort of, venerated, but not really, they're not like the workaday sort of plane. And so that, for me, I spend a lot of time teaching. I teach privately individual students, and they're trying to get into woodworking, and like, people don't necessarily have 50, 100K to just drop into a new hobby. And so that they have to be judicious about what they're buying, and so in the same way that I have, like, well, yeah, you can buy into the Festool system for sure. But there are other options available that are a little bit easier on the pocketbook, but they're still good quality. And so that mentality exists in power hand tools. It exists in machines, but until recently, it didn't exist in the hand tool world, with the exception of some companies like Hague had mentioned, Narex. Like, I'm always flabbergasted at how well those chisels work for the price of them. Like it does not,
insane.
it's like the value proposition there is insane, because like I have nice chisels, right? But every time I use a Narex, I'm like, this is actually really good. Yeah. And so, it's one of those, and you're always going to have people who like are brand loyal, brand specific. Like I want to own this, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if you guys drive many pickup trucks down there. But
it's not a mini one, it's a big one.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, like you'll get the Ford guys going after the Chevy guys and everybody going after the Dodge guys. And it's like, yeah, okay, great. But the reality is that it can be prohibitive when you first get into woodworking, especially if you're multidisciplinarian, which we're seeing a lot of nowadays. I'm sure you guys are well aware of the sort of the maker versus the woodworker. And, you get a guy like Jimmy DeRista who is equally as comfortable welding something as he is cutting something with a table saw or using a hand plane. And so that person, like if they're weighing out like, okay, do I put, this money towards a new welder, or do I buy this, hand plane that I'm not going to, use as much as the welder? So it becomes this, trying to figure out. And then when you bring it to a reasonable price, but still give people a tool that's going to work as advertised, that to me, that's a great opportunity to sort of get more people into using them.
Yeah.
I was going to say, you're not buying a project either, where it's something that constantly requires care, or you got to fiddle with it so that you're just, you're holding your tongue just right for this thing to work,
Yeah. But I mean, a couple of mates of mine down in Australia, and, this is kind of true for, other TimberCon customers down in Australia. A couple of my mates are builders, and they've bought a couple of the tools and they actually use them on their building sites. Because there are, small jobs that need to get done. And they're not cabinet makers. They're registered builders, building homes and things like that. But, one of them specializes a lot in, like using timber as a feature in building homes. And they're great for that kind of user as well. It's not just necessarily just kind of like the standard woodworkers. I mean, I think more than half of our customers identify themselves as DIYers, but it still crosses over into that space as well.
Well, Phil, also to add to your point, like a lot of times people will go out and purchase a vintage Stanley plane, and then tune it up in order to get it to work right. But unfortunately, and I'm sure you guys have noticed this as well, that like those vintage planes have really gone up in price because the scarcity of them. And like, I know that like my local hand tool guy, like if I want a Type 13, which, to me is the sort of the holy grail of when their manufacturing and quality was the best, you're looking at $200 for a jack plane. And so now you then also take the risk of, can I flatten it? Right. Yeah. And then never mind, do I have the skills to flatten it? Because that's not a trivial thing. You have to, in most cases, have to buy a new blade, and maybe a blade and chip breaker, depending on the situation. So now you started at 200. Now you're into it for another 100. Plus you've got multiple hours of work to get it up there. And, unfortunately, like people say, nobody makes planes like Stanley used to. And it's like, thank goodness for that. Because, you know what I mean? There's a lot of veneration for old Stanley planes, but the reality is that they are nowhere near the level of quality that you are getting out of modern day plane making. Well, I mean, even just the lack of understanding of ductility at that time. Yeah. Right? Like you drop a Stanley number 5 off of your workbench, at best you'll get a crack, at worst it'll explode. And so it's like, I don't know, like I've done it all. I've done all that stuff and I show people how to do that stuff. But it's like, to me now, like it's not worth it because there's a better option.
Yeah. Like in all the modern non-home improvement store plane brands, they're all using that better technology. Technology has gone a long way. And so, these days you can buy pretty much anything and they're a lot better than
what they used to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny because you're completely right. I'm sitting here and you guys can't see behind you guys, there is a Rubbermaid shelving unit full of vintage Stanleys, because that's how I bought all my lead nails and all my blue spruce stuff, is fixing them up and selling them.
Oh,
And
smart.
I would say on average, a number 5 that I sell on eBay, $180 to $200.
Wow.
Which at that point, you can buy a brand new Melbourne plane.
Yeah.
Right.
So, at that point, does it make sense for somebody? I don't know.
Well, and just the fact that with it, and this, of course, is not to take anything away the fact that you're refurbishing these things, but I mean, one aspect of the fact that a new MTC jack plane has the ability to close the mouth.
Yes,
like
100%.
That alone,
yep,
trumps everything else that
right.
You can say about the older planes, because we know that a sharp blade, a tight mouth, and sensible bites are 3 fantastic ways to mitigate tear out. So just the fact that it has that feature already makes it a better product. So, but I mean, I understand the nostalgia behind it. I own vintage planes. I own vintage wooden planes. I like, because they're cool as, right? Yeah. But at the same time, it's like when I reach for something to do the work with, right? Like, I think every woodworker is a little bit of a collector.
No.
I mean, it's not like I don't collect like guitars and ukuleles and vinyl,
right?
So you should see the tool collection, right? But at the same time, like when the rubber hits the road, there are certain tools that are going to do the job, and they're going to do the job the best, and that's what you are reaching for. And now there's an opportunity to get that without spending an enormous amount of money.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's all, you have folk that are in this as a hobby, and time is tight already. If you got kids' activities or, just daily grind stuff. And then now to say, before you get using your plane, you're going to need to spend 6 extra weeks of weekends trying to figure out how to get this plane to work.
That's right.
But sometimes that process is, kind of cathartic in itself, if you can find the time.
Yeah. And so it's just finding out who you are as a woodworker or a maker or whatever. And
the best thing I ever learned about that whole scenario, like buying used and fixing, was from Rolly Johnson. And he said that whenever you buy, it doesn't matter what it is, an old car, an old machine, an old plane, he's like, there's a triangle. And he said at every point of that triangle, there is time, money, and skill. And if you don't have an equal amount of those, it's not going to go well, right? You may have all the money in the world, but if you have no skill and time, it's not going to happen, right? If you got skill and time but no money, it's not going to happen. And so I thought that was really instructive about the whole process, because it's like I teach a 2-hour class on how to take a vintage plane and get it to a point where it's going to be functional enough to do sort of basic work with. And it's like, okay, and that's distilled down after almost 20 years of doing it. And I know what to look for, and I know the shortcuts, and I know all that stuff. But man, if you it's something, like, so.
I think it comes back to an accessibility issue. I think some people are, they're kind of turned off by the idea of buying a cheap tool that doesn't necessarily work, or, having to buy a vintage tool that, you have to spend all of that time and then, get the experience to get it right, or they're turned off by cost.
Right.
And so it's like, where do you go with that? And I think, I mean, that's, there's a little bit of a thread, and I think that it's always been this way. There's always been like a little bit of a thread that some people in woodworking are like, this is my thing. We've got to hold on to the knowledge. We've got to, we've got to keep it special, and keep it away from everybody else. But woodworking's about just getting in there and having a bit of fun. If you can't, and it's not just planes, it's everything. If you can't kind of get in there and do it well from the very beginning, there's always like a little bit of a curve for skill. But if you can't see a fairly quick improvement to get to a point where you're actually happy with the output, people just give up. And that's it's not fun for anyone.
Well, and that's an interesting thing too, because like I recently took a course with Andrew Hunter up at the Wendell Castle Workshop in Rochester, and he was teaching how to basically take a brand new Japanese hand plane blade and a brand new Japanese body, and they kind of go together, but they have to be fettled and fit. And with wood, that's a heck of a lot easier of a process. Now, not to say that it was an easy couple of days. It was a full out, starting with hitting the tip of your brand new blade with a hammer in order to get the steel to bulge. And then, there's all of these really cool nuanced things. But the interesting thing about that is that like woodworkers, when we used wooden tools, we used to fettle them all the time. We used to flatten them. We used to put blocks in to increase or decrease the sole size. That was something a woodworker could do. But then when we moved over to metal planes, well, now all of a sudden you need skills that are not woodworking. And we didn't have these sort of multidisciplinary and things, right? You had metal workers and you had woodworkers and you had casters and you had, everything was a separate trade. So you stayed in your lane, and you did your woodworking thing. So, but I mean, so even in that, like making a wooden plane, whether it's Japanese or Western style or whatever, there's that sort of fettling that has to happen, but you're a woodworker, and so you can figure it out, right? Because you're still woodworking, right? You're just doing something a little differently. Whereas with the metalworking, sometimes people don't understand how cast material works and how tool steel works, and the hardnesses and the it just gets into a lot.
And it's a different set of tools too,
right?
Where you have to have, you're not going to use you shouldn't use your wood file on the the mouth of your plane trying to open it up
rasp
a little bit or whatever. Yeah.
Those hand stitched teeth, they cut so nice. Though.
They strip off so even.
Yeah. So, Hague, talk a little bit, circling back here to the tools, as part of the process, and you alluded to it a little earlier, is the ergonomics of it, but also the design.
Yeah.
You want these tools to stand out so that when people see them, they see that it's something different from just the generic copycat casting that you'd find at a discount store kind of a thing. But on the same hand, you also don't want it to be so wackadoo that it's just not fun to use either, or comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I suppose like with the bench planes, it was pretty much just a case of form over function. I mean, we kind of took that core design of like the number 62 low angle jack. I guess we worked through things like the Norris adjuster and how that worked. But it was, I mean, the bench planes, I mean, that shape was just simply a case of let's design something cool. And things like the handles, I guess, we just went through various iterations, again, using, the largest and smallest hands we could find and, everything in between. And we just worked our way through that. I mean, I think when you start looking at things like the router planes, obviously they're quite a different design. And I mean, we very much were looking at the granny tooth designs. And I mean, there are so many functional issues around that particular design, and so we then started looking at what other router planes have been in existence, and I mean the idea kind of came from the Paul Sellers video, and I mean he's like make your own wooden bodied router plane, and that was very much born out of a traditional way of making a router plane that was around in the UK, I think back in the 1800s, and he's repopularized that, and so we there's a lot of issues with, just shoving a chisel into a block of wood in terms of functionality. And so we had to kind of work our way through a lot of the design process to get it to work simply for people who'd never picked up a router plane. So I mean, some of the simple things like like the way that the fence is attached to the router plane. So there's two screws which go through from the top of the plane into the mounting into the block underneath, and there's a it's like a split clamp arrangement. So as you tighten it up, it actually then clamps down onto that rod. And then the fence itself is reversible. So you've got one flat side, and you can unscrew it and turn it around, and then you've kind of got the two contact points. So if you're going around any kind of curved surface, you can use that on curved surfaces as well. So we spend a fair bit of time, I think, outside of the bench planes, because the bench plane design was fairly well set from, this is the function. We were kind of limited in that regard. And so we just looked at, I guess, the ergonomics and the form of it. But with pretty much all the other tools, we spent a lot more time trying to work out how to make it better. And I suppose, simple things like, the cork inserts in the spoke shave handles kind of came out of that,
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, that was one of my favorite parts of these.
Yeah. And we were a little bit nervous about it. We're like, you can't put cork in there. I mean, it's not going to look the same as the rest of the
Not
range.
with that attitude, you can't. Jeez.
But why not? Like, why not?
Yeah.
And it's worked really, really well. I guess like the natural oils from your hands tend to kind of rub off into the cork, and it tends to kind of seal it over time. But they're just incredibly comfortable. It's and you kind of have that grip on them. I mean, sometimes when you've got just the metal handled spoke shaves, especially if you're having to work in Toronto without air conditioning, because it is humid here.
Yeah, it's humid. Yeah.
Oh, just wait till you get to Atlanta next week.
Yeah. It's not going to be good.
I guess I was also thinking like my unconditioned garage workshop, metal tools are just not fun in November and December when it's winter and cold, and you could just feel it like suck the life out of your body, And
yeah, it's true. And then they added them also to the number 80 style cabinet scraper. And because you end up putting a lot of downward pressure on that tool, having that cork really provides you with just a little bit of give, so that you're not just, because most of them, like all the way back to the Stanley, like it was just a cast piece of steel and or iron or whatever, and like so you're pushing down on that, and so the shape has to be good. Which in a lot of cases they were, like different iterations of them. But then just that little added, the added bit of cork just makes it feel good in your hand.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny because like the spoke shaves, generally a spoke shave is generally quite light. So that's how we ended up with the hollow handles, and then we had to fill it in with something. And it was a choice between sticking with the maple and going with the cork. Whereas something like the cabinet scraper and all of the bench planes except for the jointer, which is heavy enough as it is, all the bench planes, we spent a bit of time working out whether it's better to go with a lighter plane or something that's a bit heavier, because from a material cost point of view, it's minimal. But, when you pick up the block plane or pick up the smoother or the jack, you can feel that extra weight. And we pretty much went with that idea because that extra mass kind of really sits on the workpiece, and so as you're driving it through, it just seems to. We found it was more comfortable, and I suppose there was a conversation, especially with the jack. If you're using it for a long time, is fatigue going to set in? I suppose we went with the idea that people are going to use it not sparingly, but you're not going to be using it for incredibly long periods of time where that does set in. So we went through all of those processes, and it was kind of cool because while it was just originally, myself, Alex, there was another colleague, John, that was involved pretty much all along the way. We got a lot of feedback from people who are using the tools day to day. So it was informed by a lot of woodworkers. Yeah. And I think that's maybe one of the differences. I think you look at some of the brands, not the premium brands, but certainly, a lot of the budget brands that are floating around, they're just making, they don't necessarily understand what the final outcome of them is. they're just kind of whacking them together and getting them out the door and cheapest cost. But I think really, and that shows in the lack of functionality of those tools. Whereas with these, it was very much driven by people who were using it. I think, and that's why I think, when people like Vic get it, they're not shit.
I'm feeling this becoming a shirt,
Yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah. I mean, and I think it speaks to, like, it was a completely honest statement. Yeah. I realized after I said it that it was probably not very complimentary, but in a way, it was because it's like I really had no expectations for these tools, and then when it sort of shocked me, and then I see it every time. Like I see, like when we did a couple of shows and we've had people, pick them up, and I'm like, I sort of stand back and I just watch their expression. And probably the one that sticks out most to me was Ben Strano. He was at the show in New England, and he picked up one of the spoke shaves and he started using it, and then he like kind of would like look at it and be like, and then he would use it some more, and he was like, he walked up to it with that, all right, let's give this a go, right? And then he started using, he's like, and that's like everybody who picks up the block plane for the first time, they're like, whoa, that's got a lot of weight to it. And so it's not what you expect. Yeah. And then you're pleasantly surprised when you start using it and sharpening it. And, even though it's an M2 steel blade, I've tested it out with the Scary Sharp method, with diamond honing papers, with oil stones, water stones, diamond stones, Tormek. And like, to me, it's not any more difficult than your typical alloyed steel, like an A2 or a powdered metal. Everything's more difficult to sharpen than high carbon steel or O1. Right. But that comes at a cost as well, because you're sharpening a lot more often. But
we can't you can't offer a plane in Australia with an O1 blade.
No.
I am an O1 fanboy. I would show you my tattoo, but we'd have to blur it out.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of high carbon steel too.
I love O1.
Yeah, same.
And spend more time sharpening in Australia than doing anything else.
Right. And that's the problem with
that's true. That is completely true with your timber.
Yeah. And and that was the thing. And I mean, North America wasn't an afterthought, but it wasn't necessarily a focus either. It was.
That's all right. You guys aren't our focus either.
Yeah.
That's the other side of the T-shirt.
Yeah.
But I mean, everything we do is informed by our customers. And our customers are Aussies, and we know the material. Like, we use the material ourselves. We know exactly what we're working with. And I mean, there's even like that argument of Jarrah's, it's harder to work with than red gum. I've lived on both sides of the country, and it's like, I'm pretty sure it's the same tree. It's like, it looks a little bit different, but it's just like that. I'm sure there's like the same arguments that the Americans and the Canadians have.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's funny. So can we talk real quick about woodworking in Australia? Just because most of our audience being in North America.
Yeah.
There is a huge woodworking market in Australia, right? Some of my favorite tools come from Australia. I'm sitting here looking at my Vicmark lathe. There's a lot of Australian tool makers. It's a pretty big thing down there, isn't it?
It's definitely had a resurgence. I mean, I was around, and like, maybe I'm showing my age. I'm not even that old. I just started really young, I guess.
He's not.
But like, I was around when a lot of the machinery manufacturers went under, and it all moved offshore. And it primarily just came down to, like the cost was prohibitive, and like the barrier to entry was just way too high. And I think at the time Asia was just so cheap that, people just couldn't reconcile the difference. And it's great actually that Vicmark have held on, because I know that there are some US brands that I guess play in that space in terms of quality, but like, you can't get any of those US brands in Australia because Vicmark are just, you could say that they're number one, but I mean, the reality is for woodturners in Australia, they're the only one, you know, and
Well, I mean, what are you going to do? Ship a, 1,000-pound lathe down to Australia? I mean, I guess Vic Mark sends them all over, but,
Well, a few people do, and like I haven't got enough experience with them to comment one way or the other. I just know that, for 95% of the serious woodturners in Australia, they choose Vic Mark. But I mean, there's always been great tool makers. Like Terry Gordon's one of them, and I mean, he's been around for a very, very long time. He's an absolutely fantastic guy.
I love his tools. I have a few in my shop, and they're just my shoulder plane is an H&T Gordon, and every time I pick it up, it just feels awesome.
Yeah, well, he's just like a quietly cool guy. I mean, like I met him when I was a teenager, and I think back then I probably acted like a little bit like a snot-nosed punk, but and I got treated like one by most people too. But not by people like Terry. He's always been a really great guy, and he's also come from that, I guess, school of thought of woodworking's supposed to be fun and we're all in this together. But and there's obviously Colin Clinton. That those two have worked together for a long time. But there's a couple of relatively new people on the scene at the moment. Like there's Devon at Ironbark Tools, and
I have a few of his pieces here.
Wow.
And then there's Brian Shigeru, who's actually a Newfoundlander who I think married an Aussie, and then he moved down there, and then he's making infills that are sort of. I see the comments that Conrad Sauer makes on his builds, and they're very complimentary.
Which is in itself is a big
Like, I mean, if Conrad says anything nice to me, I think I've won the lottery. Not that he's
not that Conrad's an asshole.
No, exactly. We're not saying that. We're not saying that, Conrad. But like, I mean, it just like he's such a talented plane maker, designer, woodworker that like, if he's giving praise to this, this relatively new plane maker in Australia, like that's a big deal. And it's interesting. Like, I think the woodworking industry or the woodworking world. So from a furniture maker designer standpoint, like I was shocked at the level of work that was being done in Australia and in New Zealand. And I was the first time I was down there, first or second time I was down there teaching, I went to this amazing gallery called Bungendore Gallery.
Oh,
yeah. And so it's actually run by an American. It's run from a guy who's originally from New York. And he, like, I walked in there and I spent hours just like looking at all of these incredible pieces. They were so like all studio furniture for the most part. But like as a North American, you look at these timbers that they're using and it's just a completely different palette, right? Than what we're used to in North America. And so like the same way we, judiciously use walnuts and cherries and all that other stuff, they're doing exactly the same thing. But like the woods are so impactful and like really like pungent color, like just
jewel toned kind of.
Really, really cool. So like I didn't expect hard. But I mean like the level of work, like I would almost go on record as saying that it surpasses that's happening in North America. It's incredibly well done, well thought out, considerate furniture. It's impressive.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing, And I think it's definitely gone through a generational change fairly recently, and I don't think it's even COVID related. I mean, we started seeing that prior to COVID kicking in, but a lot of the new younger makers that are coming through, they're coming through with a very different aesthetic. And I don't know what it's like over here. I mean, people in Australia kind of talk about how kind of went down and then it's come back up again. But I guess my experience with that is it's been pretty consistent for a long time.
There's been a changing of the guard here for sure.
Yeah,
like where the standard guys that have been sort of studio furniture making since like the 70s and 80s, And then there's this new breed of furniture makers and designers, the Larissa Huffs, the Aspingold, and they're these incredibly talented young woodworkers, which really sort of pisses me off a little bit, because it's like, it's like I've been doing this for a long time, and it's like, man, these ideas are so cool and so fresh and so awesome. And it's like, it's the same thing with guitar. Like, the average 15-year-old can outplay me, and I've been at it for 40 years.
Yeah.
But that's just a testament to, how consistently I'm willing to suck. But yeah, it's a super cool place. And I think the woodworking world has seen a bit of it kind of, sort of plateaued, and then now it's starting to come up again. So.
I mean, when you talk about that, I think that's true of everything. Like the current masters are kind of built on the shoulders of the previous generation.
It's true, yeah.
Yeah.
I just hate that I'm the previous generation.
Get off Vic's lawn.
Yeah. You see this ball? This ball's mine now.
Oh, I had neighbors like that.
We all did.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's circle back here, close everything out. If someone in North America, not an afterthought, wanted to get the Melbourne Tool Company planes, where can they find them?
melbournetool.com. So we have stock in North America, ground shipping across the continent. In Canada, we have 4 dealers. So if you're in Canada and you're on the site, look in the top right hand corner. There's a find a dealer button. Choose your favorite one. In the US, I believe we shall have how many?
I think we have 3 or 4 that are about to pull the trigger.
Excellent.
And so again, on the US site, you'll be able to, because it geotags, and so it knows if you're in the US or it knows if you're in Canada. I don't know what happens when you're in Niagara Falls. I think it just gets confused. But yeah, you'll be able to do a find the retailer thing there as well. And so
by the end of August.
Yep, I would think. Yep. So so people will be able to buy locally from their sort of favorite local store, as well as be able to order online.
And if your favorite local store doesn't have it, go and complain to them about it and get them to get on it.
Right. We're looking at you, Woodsmith Store in Des Moines, Iowa. So
there we go.
All right. Well, that's great. Well, Hague, Vic, I appreciate you guys coming on the show today and talking about the tools. It's a lot of fun to see a new face and a flavor come around, and just to see different perspectives. I mean, we were talking about that with woodworkers, but tool makers too provides a new look at something. Even if it ends up being familiar, there's a freshness in perspective. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Cheers, Phil. Thanks for having us.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody, to another episode of the ShopNotes podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or smart remarks, I want to hear about them. You can send them to woodsmith@woodsmith.com. You can check us out on our YouTube channel. Write down any questions or comments, smart remarks there as well. That's what the internet is for. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye.